Good morning. It's Bob, Dennis Murray. Um, Today is podcast 12, and it's more about the psychological skill of judging. Um, there's a, um, a lot involved in the difference in the ways people judge. Um, it can feel very cold when people are extremely logical and push things away from themselves in order to be as objective as possible. Um, and it can feel warm and wonderful uh, when somebody you're close to um, is making a judgment of you based on their personal preference. You seem to be very much the kind of person that fits in the side of the photo album that they strongly prefer. And it just feels fabulous. Um, so there's a feeling aspect. People who tend to judge by using a rule book and by as being objective as possible, um, it can feel cold to others. And conversely, warmth around those people who use feeling. So there's that aspect. The other is relation to common sense. Bear in mind, some of the people that judge using a rule book um, are not skilled at high level analytical logic. They're logical, but they can't be rocket scientists. So they can be accountants, they can be lawyers, they can be, they can be doctors, they can be a lot of things. Um, but they're probably not going to be rocket scientists. That requires this deeper level of analytical intelligence that I was talking about in terms of intellectual arrogance. But it has an enormous value to society. It's what allows us to feed a vast population. Giving just a little glance backward, uh, at the time of Jesus, for example, the world population was measured in a small number of millions. I don't know, 10, 30, something. I've forgotten. I've looked it up about 12 times, but I forget things quickly. Um, but a really small number of people. And, there's periods when we got to a billion people and then, you know, um, 2 billion, and now we're pushing 8 billion. So we owe that to rocket scientists. We owe that to this high level analytical logic. They're the ones that are able to create science and use it to help us feed vast numbers of people. Um, but there's also plenty of people who don't have that skill, but who do, they don't have the skill to that level, but they do judge the same way. They judge logically, they use a rule book. Um, and and so there's a big difference. We think of the absent-minded professor, the absent-minded professor, who doesn't have any common sense. Typically, um, we're referring to a guy who has a good deal of analytical intelligence. He's really a bright one, and also typically, uh, very often, don't have much common sense. And so there is some relation to this type of judging and common sense. The other kind of judging, the more warm personal preference kind, um, is more comfortable with common sense, which involves a mix of three things, principally um, intuitions and experience and a little bit of quick logic. Not a big elaborate thing with a rule book and a whole series of propositions. If A, then B, then B, then C. Not like that. Um, but it's not illogical common sense. It's often wrong. Um, but even rocket scientists are wrong. There's no way to not ever be wrong. And it wouldn't be worth even trying to not ever be wrong. You wouldn't be able to do anything in life. You'd be all bound up trying to avoid doing something wrong. So you got to let go of that and move ahead. So the this whole thing about the two ways of judging is kind of complicated. It has a lot of stuff going on to it. Um, so the a related aspect is in the same occupation, there may be people who judge both ways and who do pretty well. But in quite often we see that some people are better suited to some occupations than others. So for a judge, for example, I practiced law for 20 years and I was in a small law firm in a small town where I lived. What a lovely opportunity to have 5 minutes between work and home. And you really care about the boards and committees you belong to because they're your neighbors and friends. Um, and I had three partners who were members of the Maryland House of Delegates at the same time, and a bunch of guys left the firm over the years to become judges. Um, so I know something about law and something about politics. But you know, at a trial court or at a traffic court, small claims court, you want a guy who has a lot of common sense, so that um, he may make judgments by the book, but he's not going to be a rocket scientist. Um, those guys have too little comfort with common sense, and man, you need a lot of common sense to be a judge in you know the lower level courts. Um, and so often he's going to make decisions based on personal preferences. But when you get to the appellate court, you need a judge who's pretty much got at least um, uh, a rule book in his head. And you know, the higher up you get, the more you need analytical intelligence as well, so that he's got a very fancy grasp of logic, and he's got a rule book that's really quite special and allows him to deal with broad concepts instead of just should Joe win this case against Fred. It's what does it mean to the community if Joe's point of view is upheld. And it's a lot bigger question and a lot harder question and requires more analytical abilities. So a little bit about more today about the two ways of judging. There's just a whole bunch of stuff that's related to this. And this kind of appreciation of our difference is part of how we come into a place in the middle where our sense of connection to others has been reinforced with learning more about differences and similarities so that our differences are less frightening and less disconcerting. And our similarities are appreciated more and taken in a context. Okay, so enough for today. See you tomorrow.